Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Molly Fay Cruz. I'm with the United Way of Snohomish County. And our funding focuses on supporting families with kids 0 to 8. So it's really exciting for us. We're really grateful to be partnering with the Early Learning Coalition and for the Institute of Learning and Brain Sciences to bring you this conversation about why supporting kids in their development at those ages is so critical. A couple of logistics before we get started. You as attendees will be muted, and so as questions come up for you throughout the presentation, at the bottom of your screen you should see a Q&A button. If you click that, you'll be able to submit questions, and we'll take several breaks throughout the presentation to go through those questions and answer them. The chat is available to talk to me as a host if you're having any technical difficulties. And then a couple times in the presentation, we'll be doing polling. So you'll have a little dialog box pop up and we'll have you vote on a multiple choice question. So chat me if you need any assistance, and otherwise I'll turn it over to Terry and Amelia. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm Terry Clark, and I coordinate the Early Learning Coalition of Snohomish County. I'm joined today by Elaine Larson, one of our co-chairs. We welcome you to the first session of a 4-part series about the importance of early learning. The Early Learning Coalition partnered with the United Way of Snohomish County to create this series in support of the core collaborative work. These sessions are designed to help core partners understand why focusing on the early years is essential to ending the cycle of childhood trauma, school failure, and ultimately poverty. Today, we have invited everyone involved with the 5 core collaboratives. While we were at it, we invited other leaders from our county as well. We are pleased that so many of you could join us today. Originally, these sessions were to be in person, but that's not an option at this time. Rather than rescheduled, we decided to try this virtual format, and we thank you for participating. With Molly's help and United Way's Zoom account, we will be successful. We will have another virtual session on May 29th, and the topic of that session is Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health, presented by Carol Good, a clinical infant mental health mentor and promoting first relationships trainer with the parent-child relationship programs at the University of Washington. Sessions are also planned for June and July, and we hope those will be in person, but who knows? Stay tuned for more information. Today, we are pleased to have Amelia Bachleda, PhD, from the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences, known as iLabs, at the University of Washington. We are very lucky to have this esteemed research center in our backyard. Amelia is an outreach and education specialist at iLabs, and iLabs is an interdisciplinary research center focused on human learning and the brain. As a trained science communicator, Amelia works to put the latest science into the hands of those who can act on it by developing resources and delivering trainings nationwide. Amelia has a PhD in neurobiology and loves to learn about how things work, particularly the brain, and figuring out ways to make accessing that information easier for everyone. Amelia is from Snohomish, so we can count her as one of our own. Understanding early brain development helps answer the question why the early years of development are so important to success in life. Please ask questions and share comments throughout the presentation. Elaine and I will monitor the Q&A space and share out with Amelia at the end of each section of her presentation. And without further ado, here is Amelia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you, Molly. I'm so pleased to be here today. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I'm excited to get started. You know, this is a time of great flexibility for all of us, and I'm so glad that we can do this digitally. Have a moment for this to come up. All right. Well, yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so pleased to be here and to talk about the brain. I love this work. I love to be able to share some of the brain science with everyone who's working so hard to improve the lives of children and families, and that is all of you. And I so appreciate that work. And it's extra fun to be able to do things in my, for my home community. I grew up in Snohomish, and it's always fun to do local events. So I thought I'd start with sharing just a little bit about who the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences are, if you're not familiar with us. So we're a research institute here at the University of Washington. There's about 80 of us, and we work to understand human learning, but particularly how young children learn. And we think about all different areas of learning, from brain development to how we learn language to how we learn social interactions. We also have an outreach team, and that's what I'm a part of. I love this job because our job is to take all of that great science that's happening and get it out into the community. So that's my full-time job. And we work with parents, early educators, policymakers, anyone who's working to support thriving children. So that's a little bit about iLabs and who we are. I thought it would be nice to get started this morning with a little poll. This will also, I'll ask you a few questions throughout. This will also give you a chance to practice with the polling tool here. So I wanted to check in. How is everyone today? This is a wild time that we're living in, and some days we feel really great. Some days we're okay. Sometimes we're not sure how we feel, and some days are not great or bad days. So while I hope no one's having a bad day, that is an okay feeling. So I wanted to check in with everybody and see how you're doing.
So Amelia, I'm thinking people need to be prompted to click one of the questions, one of the answers, because we've had somebody on chat asking or saying how she's feeling.
Okay, great. Yes. So you should see a little poll window pop up in front of you. You should be able to pick one of those choices. All right. Thank you. Okay, so it seems like most of us are feeling pretty good today. That makes me very happy. I'm glad everyone is feeling, many people are feeling pretty good. We've got some okays, and we've got some, I'm okay, I'm not sure how I feel. And that is such a, I feel like I go through that every part of every day, right? It changes throughout the day. Some parts of the day I'm like, oh, I'm feeling great. Some parts of the day I'm like, I don't know what's going on. So thank you for sharing that with us and doing this poll together. All right, so let's get started. The first thing that I want to share with you today is talking about brain development. That's a big area of our research here at iLabs, and a big area that I spend a lot of time thinking about. So one of the main messages I really want to share with you is this idea that we grow our brains. You've maybe heard that we build our brains too. Over the course of our lives, all of the experiences that we have really shape our brains and who we become. So let's take a look and think about what that looks like. So many of you perhaps are familiar with this, but there is an enormous amount of early brain growth in the first few years of life. First, when we're born, our brains are already about 25% of their adult size. And that is proportionately enormous. None of the rest of our body parts at that time in our lives are 25% of their adult size. It's already quite large. But then the brain continues to grow, and quite rapidly. This is phenomenal to me. By the end of the first year of life, children's brains are already 70% of their adult size. That is enormous. By the time they're 5, they're about 92% of their adult size, and on through adulthood. Now, while this is an incredible amount of growth, I really want to make the point that if any of you have spent any time at all with a 5-year-old before, or remember your 5-year-old self, you know that 92% of adult size doesn't mean 92% done, right? It's not 92% developed, period. It's just 92% of its adult size, which means that there's all of this potential and growth that's happening in the early years, but we're not finished. It continues throughout our lives. So let's take a look at what's actually going on in the brain in this early period of brain development. Okay, so when we're born, we have about 86 billion neurons in our brains, and that's about the amount of neurons that we have as adults. So we're born with almost all of the neurons that we'll ever have. And the neurons or brain cells is kind of your like communications team. And every time we learn something new, or we either build a new physical connection between the cells, the brain cells in our brain, or we make that connection stronger. And that's called a synapse. And while we're born with almost all of the brain cells we'll ever have, we aren't born with all of those synapses or connections. And that's a really good thing, right? Because we need to be able to learn things over the course of our lives. If we weren't able to make new connections, we wouldn't be able to learn things. And being able to make these new connections allows us to perfectly tune our brains to exactly the lives that we're living. And what's I think so amazing is that between 0 and 3, the latest estimate is that because children are learning so much so quickly, the brain makes about 1 million new neuronal connections each second. It's mind-boggling. I love that our minds can't even wrap around what our minds do. I think it's amazing. So there's so much growth and connection and learning that's happening in these first early years of life. I like to think about this a little bit like building an ecosystem if we're thinking about growing our brains, right? So you can imagine that when we're born, it's a little bit like a forest that has been reforested after it's been maybe burned, maybe that happened. So there's these young trees that have been planted. Those are like the cells in our brain when we're born. There's these little trees. And then as we grow, as we learn, as our lives shape our brains, the little brain cells grow and branch out and have all of these branches. And we grow this complex and amazing ecosystem that is our brain. And it becomes so much more than just those cells that we begin with. So we kind of grow and establish this ecosystem in our brains. I wanted to take a minute to think about what this actually looks like. And so I have this little activity for you. You'll be able to use the poll function again here in a moment. So what you're seeing on the screen is pictures, tiny pictures of what the brain looks like at different points in development. So these are illustrations of what a tiny chunk of the brain looks like at different points in development. So you can see the sort of the dark color triangle globs. Those are the cells, the brain cells, and all of the lines, those are the connections, the synapses forming between the cells in the brain. And so these are pictures of what the brain looks like at 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 4 years, and 6 years. Now they're not in order. And what I'd like you to do is to think about, put these in order. Which one do you think is the picture of the 1 month brain? Do you think it's A, B, C, D, or E? And go through all of that. And that what I'm gonna ask you to do for the poll, once you've put these in order, is to think about which of these would you put as the last? which illustration do you think is what a 6-year-old brain looks like? So think about that, and then think about which illustration here would you put last at 6 years? A, B, C, D, or E? And we'll give you a few minutes to do that. All right, let's check those results. All right, so we have a little bit of a spread here, but most people put E, and that is the red one there that you're seeing on the screen. So let's go through these together and see which one is the most. Now, some people also pick D, which is this one. So let's go through this together. Okay, so 1 month. This is what the brain at 1 month looks like. 3 months, 6 months, 4 years, and 6 years. So a lot of you put E, 4 years, which is very common. And I do this activity for a reason, because that's the most common answer. And it's often surprising, right? Like 4 years, that is when there's the most connections. There's the most dense connections. But this really amazing process happens in the brain. And some of you put D, which makes me think that perhaps some of you have heard of this before. This process in the brain is called pruning. And what happens is that children are learning so much so quickly that they actually overproduce the amount of connections in their brains. They make too many connections. And so what the brain has to do is to go and prune away, take away the connections that we don't need, and the ones that are left are stronger. You can think a little bit about this like caring for a rose bush. And maybe this is something we're all, many of us are out in our gardens right now, if we are lucky enough to have a garden and at home. And I've seen a lot of people in my neighborhood thinking about doing some pruning. So what happens first is our brains are like a brain or a rose bush. They're blooming. There's so much growth. We're making all of these connections. Children are learning all the time, every moment. But then we get so many connections that it gets to be too much. It's not efficient to have that many connections in your brain. And so what happens is that we prune away the connections we don't need. We don't lose any neurons. We just prune away those connections that we don't need. And the result is a rosebush or a brain that's really healthy and thriving. The remaining connections are stronger, they're more efficient, and it works more like an adult brain. Now, I've heard parents sometimes say, like, I don't want my child's brain to prune. I just want them to have all those connections. And no, it's really an important process to make sure that the connections that we have are the ones that are strong and really working for us. And this process is affected by the experiences that we have in our lives. The more often we have an experience, whether that experience is a good experience for us or a hard experience for us, the more likely it is that those connections are going to be strong and the ones that are going to be kept. So the connections that are kept in our brains are the ones that we use often and over and over and over again. And so in this way, our early years, those experiences that we're having in our early years really do shape the foundational architecture of our brains. They determine which connections are built, which ones are made stronger, and which ones are pruned away. Now, brain development, as I said before, is never done, right? We continue throughout our lives. We can learn things throughout our lives. There's just points in our lives where it's easier to learn these new things. Early childhood is one. And perhaps if any of you have older children, you might recognize or think that the teenage years is another time when our brains go through this cycle of blooming and pruning. There's a lot of neural rearrangement that happens in the teen years as well. But the biggest period really is in early childhood. And sometimes you could have heard of this period as sort of a sensitive period or maybe a critical period. These are waves of blooming and pruning that happen in the brain. And so the brain is primed to learn different skills at different times in development. When we're first born, our brain is really fine-tuning many of those sensory skills. And then pretty quickly, we start learning language and motor skills. And then those higher cognitive skills, you see from the graph on your screen, those stretch far out and into our early 20s as we continue to develop our higher cognitive skills. So that has sort of a longer curve. We've been seeing so many graphs of curves lately. So you can see the different shapes of these curves represent different times in development where these different skills in our brain we're really working on developing. So I want to take you through a few examples of how these different skills develop over the course of our lives. So when we're talking about sensory development happens really early. So for example, children in their third trimester can already begin to hear and learn from the voice of their birth parent. And research that we've done here at iLabs in collaboration with others, we found that from just a few hours after birth, children are able to recognize their birth parent's language or languages from a language that they don't recognize or they've never heard before. So that sensory development starts early. It begins in the womb for many senses. And we're born with this exquisite ability to understand and pick up information from our world. Thinking about language. So language development also starts, sensory, our ability to hear begins very early. And you can even see that early development of language. And that continues from birth and through her childhood. And I wanted to share a little bit with you about what's going on inside the brain. So here at iLabs, we have a lot of researchers that work on a lot of different activities, different research activities. And one of the tools that we have that allows us to do this is a brain imaging tool. It's called magnetoencephalography, or MEG for short. It's a really big word, but what I wanted to share with you is this amazing tool that allows us to look inside and see what's happening in the brains of children. One of our co-directors here, Dr. Patricia Kuhl, likes to call this the hairdryer from Mars, and you can see it there sort of on the left side of your screen. And I'm going to play this little video for you. This is one of our young volunteers, baby Emma. Let's see if it'll start. So this tool is amazing, particularly for looking at what's going on inside the brains of children, because it's completely quiet, it's non-invasive. She can move her head around. And you can see she's kind of got this glassed over look in her eyes. She is looking at one of the people that have the most important jobs at iLabs, and that is the toy waver. And so they have to wave a toy in a way that is, mesmerizing enough to keep her calm, but not too exciting that she's gonna reach out and grab it. So here she is, she's listening to the sounds of language. She's got little headphones in. And this video actually has sound, so you can see how quiet it is. If any of you have ever been in an MRI machine before, you know how claustrophobic that feels, how loud it is. So this is an amazing tool that we have here at iLabs to really look and see what's going on inside the brains of children. And it allows us to see from even a very young age what's going on in their brains. And one of the things that we've been really interested in is to see how the brain reacts to language and starts to learn language. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you the results of the studies, but it's a little difficult to see what's going on. So I want to introduce you to the two regions of the brain that you're going to see. What you're going to see is a picture of the brain and then the averaged brain activity over all of the subjects, all of the children in this study, as this orange glob of neural activity. And you're going to see it in two different locations in the different brains. One is the language perception area, and that's the part of our brain that's really important for understanding that what we're listening to is language. And then the other is the language production area, and that is a part of our brain that helps us actually produce language. So it's connected to motor centers in our brains. It's active in me right now as I'm speaking to you and producing these words. So these are two areas that we're really interested in for language development. So when we look at the brains of newborns, we see that activity while they're sitting in the MEG machine in that speech perception area. And that's not too surprising. They're listening to speech and they're able to tell that they're listening to speech, but there's not any activity in the speech production area. Also not that surprising. They're certainly not speaking yet at this age. At 12 months, we see activity both in the speech perception area and the speech production area. Again, not too surprising. 12 months is when infants are maybe starting to say their first word. But what we thought was really interesting is what we saw at 6 months old. So at 6 months old, we see activity both in the speech perception area and the speech production area. And this is long before infants are saying their first word. It's also important to know that while they're in the brain scanner, they're not saying anything. It's just their brains are lighting up. It's as if they're practicing, they're getting ready to figure out as they're listening to speech, how would they make those sounds? How would they produce those sounds? And this is one of the reasons why it is so important to use language with young children long before they begin talking themselves, because their brains are rehearsing, they're getting ready. All of those millions of connections that are forming each second are starting to form this architecture of the brain and to learn language. To give you an example of just how quickly children learn language when they're in the context of this sort of back and forth interaction. We talk about this a lot in early childhood and in learning in general, this back and forth interaction of sharing where you build on what one person is doing. So a group of researchers, not at iLabs, did this research study where they invited infants and adults into the lab, and they either instructed their caregiver to respond in kind with what the child is saying, to sort of build on what the child is saying, or to just sort of respond randomly. And if you're building, and what they found is that if the caregiver responded what we like to call contingently or sort of in kind with the child, if they build on what the child is saying, within this 20 minutes that they were together for this study, they already saw changes in the complexity of this child's language. And so I'll go through an example. So for example, a child might say, ba, and the adult might say something like, if the child had a doll, oh yes, that's a doll. Look at that doll you have. What a nice doll. And then over the course of this interaction, the child might change from ba to a da, which is a little bit closer to doll. And so in this period where the parents are able, the caregivers are able to have this back and forth interaction, children build an amazing amount of language skills. And one of the things I wanted to bring up here is that, you know, the ability to have this back and forth time that is uninterrupted is not available to every parent and to every family all the time. And it's one of the reasons why we see that language skills and socioeconomic status are correlated as young as 18 months. And that's for a variety of reasons. If we're thinking about how can we support families and children, we need to think about both the children and the parents and caregivers, right? So children thrive when their basic needs are met and they're in the context of relationships with caring and responsive adults. That responsiveness is so important, like I shared in that language interaction, where the caregivers are able to respond to what the child is doing, to recognize what the child is doing and build on it and have this rich interaction. But it's also important to think about parents and caregivers, right? parents are best able to support children and help them have those sorts of rich interactions when their basic needs are met, when they have the time to engage with their child and their stress level is low or manageable, right? And we know that now in particular is a very challenging time. And I want to say too, you know, not every moment can or should be this back and forth interaction, right? That's not something that is reasonable. No parent can do that. But having moments of time throughout the day that they are able to do that really supports children's early development. Another area of research that we spent a lot of time thinking about is the development of more than one language. So what happens in the brain of children when they're learning not just one language, but two or maybe three languages? So here I have another video to show you of the MEG machine. So here you can see the toy waiver in action. This is another one of our young volunteers. She's learning Spanish and English, and she's listening to both of those language sounds in the MEG. And so we were able to find, to see what was going on in the brains of children. And what we found is that children who were just learning one language, in this case it was English, had a very strong response to English at 11 months, but not very strong response to Spanish. Children that were learning Spanish and English already at 11 months of age, really young, we could already see their brain specializing for both Spanish and English. And again, this just goes to show how early the brain begins to learn, to specialize, and to build that foundational architecture, to build all of those connections and those skills that we're going to use throughout the rest of our lives. There's another really interesting thing that we found here. One of the things that we saw was in the brains of children that were learning more than one language, we saw some extra activity in the frontal region of the brain right here. This part of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex helps us with a lot of different skills. You can see here the responses. So that pink trace, that's the activity from children that are learning two languages, and the green trace, just one language. Now, the prefrontal cortex helps us with skills like executive function skills, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Those are being able to pay attention, to focus, to plan, to be creative. Children who are learning more than one language, it seems as though they may have a little boost in that flexible thinking skills. And scientists think this is the case because when you're learning more than one language, you're constantly switching back and forth between different language rules, often between different cultural contexts, and you build this ability to be flexible, to think flexibly. And we've seen this type of activity difference in the brains of adults who are learning more than one language, so it's really amazing to see it already here at 11 months of age. I wanted to talk too about language learning and what that looks like over the course of our lives. When we're young, our brains are exquisitely sensitive to learning the sounds of language. We are, as children, excellent language learners, but it gets harder for us as we go through our lives. What this study looked at, which is an older study, again, not from iLabs, but one of the first to really show this sensitive period in language learning, that, you know, that opportunity for blooming and pruning in the brain. What they did is they measured, they had a grammar test that they gave to people who were born in the United States and were born learning English, so a native English speaker. And then they looked at people who had immigrated to the United States and started learning language, a second language, between the ages of 3 and 7. And what they found was the grammar score for those children that started learning a second language young, indistinguishable. But then as we get older, those grammar scores get a little bit worse, a little bit worse, a little bit worse. Now notice on the graph, see that little hash mark on the bottom left hand, that stops at 200. So we're not at 0 at all, right? We're not at 0. We can always learn a second language over the course of our lives. It just might be a little bit harder for us, right? Because we're sort of out of this window when our brain is primed to learn that. We're probably just going to have to repeat that more. We don't have, as adults, we don't have a million new neuronal connections forming in our brains every second. You know, sometimes I wish we did, but that also sounds a little bit exhausting to be learning so much all the time. And it is one of the reasons why young children need a lot of naps, because when we sleep, we consolidate what we learn. And so children are learning so much, they get exhausted. They need that time to consolidate what they're learning. Anyways, when we're thinking about language learning, there really is this window of opportunity when we're younger to learn more than one language. And as adults, we can learn a second language. It's going to take us more time. We're going to have to repeat practice more and more. And perhaps we might have an accent because it gets a little bit harder for us to be able to hear the differences in those language sounds. That window of opportunity isn't open in the same way that it used to be. So this last piece on here I want to talk about is higher cognitive development. And I want to talk a little bit more about executive functioning here. So you'll notice that from this curve, it's a flatter curve. It goes over a longer period of time rather than that peak for sensory development or language and motor development. And this extends well into our early 20s. If you look at a graph of how we build executive function skills over time, you can see that there's this rapid rise in executive function skills between the ages of 2 and 5. And then we slowly continue to build to this peak about in our late teens and early 20s. And it's important to think about the development of executive function, which is the ability to pay attention and focus, to control our impulses, to think flexibly, and our short-term memory. You can see here on the graph for children, you know, at age 2, children do not have a lot of executive function skills yet. They're building them. It is not reasonable to ask a 2-year-old to control their impulses. They do not have those executive function skills yet. They haven't built those connections in their brain yet, but they are building them every day. They're working on it. And the executive function skills that children work on and build in childhood, again, influence their executive function skills later. So I want to share a little game with you. Now, normally I do this in person. So I'm not sure if you want to do this along with me or not, and I can't see if you're doing it along with me or not, but I'll take you through what I would do in person, and it's a good opportunity to stretch a little bit. I don't know about you, but I'm spending a lot of time, my job, I'm at my computer most days, and I spend a lot of time sitting down on my computer, and I don't go into the office, and so I'm just sitting down a lot. That's what my job looks like right now. So this kind of thing is good for me to do. So this is a game that's based on head, shoulders, knees, and toes, but there's a little twist. So in the first part of the game, and it's actually a research study too, the game goes, I would say, touch your head. And when I say touch your head, please touch your toes. And when I say touch your toes, please touch your head. Okay, so I'm gonna take this away. So let's do it together. And you can, you know, do it or not do it. So touch your toes. Touch your head, touch your head, touch your toes, touch your head. Okay, whoever did it with me, great job. Whoever didn't do it with me, great job too. Everybody, gold star. Okay, the next part is knees and shoulders. So for this part, same idea, but instead of touching your knees, I want you to touch your shoulders, and instead of touching your shoulders, I want you to touch your knees. Okay, touch your knees, touch your shoulders, touch your shoulders, touch your shoulders, touch your knees, touch your shoulders. Okay, there's one last. Okay, are you ready? Touch your head, touch your shoulders, touch your toes, touch your knees, touch your head, touch your shoulders. Okay. Great job. So I love to do this game because it's kind of fun. And researchers have actually used this game to look at the executive function of children as they're going into kindergarten. Because what have I asked you to do in this task? Well, you need to practice all of those executive function skills that we were just talking about, right? You have to pay attention and focus on me. You have to use your short-term memory. You have to remember the rules of the game. You have to control your impulses. I'm telling you to do one thing and your impulse is to do that one thing, but you have to actually do another thing. And you have to think flexibly and creatively to do this task. And what these researchers found was that how well children do on this task actually predicts their academic outcome in all areas of school a few years later. So how well children do on this task is predictive of how well they'll do in different academic areas later in school, which means that these skills are really non-trivial. They're really important. These are some of the most important skills that we're learning in this early years of our lives. And how are we learning these skills? You know, one of the things that is really important to think about, and this is another study that I love, researchers, again, not at iLabs, did this study, and they looked at what with young children was helping children to build executive functioning skills. And what they found was the quality of the interactions between an infant and a caregiver were predictive of a child's executive functioning skills. And they were looking at things like parental sensitivity, mind-mindedness, so the ability of the caregiver or the parent to realize that they have a mind and their child has a mind and those minds are separate, and celebrate that, as well as autonomy support. And again, these really rich interactions of following the child's lead and supporting the child as they move through the world. The aspect that was particularly important, that was the most significant, was this idea of autonomy support. Now, autonomy support is helping children to do something on their own, to allow them to do some tasks for themselves. So if you look at these two pictures, they're two pictures of a woman and a child building together. Now the picture on the left, that's an example of, in this particular snippet, we don't know what the rest of this interaction looked like, in this particular snippet of the adult sort of leading that interaction. She's putting that block, that next block on the tower. In the picture on the right, you can see an example. This is what we're thinking about when we're thinking about autonomy support. That parent, that adult is watching as the child works to build the tower. Now that tower is probably not going to be as tall as the one on the left, and it might be a little bit slower, but the child is able to sort of lead that interaction. And I have a little video to show you of the kind of things that we're thinking about when we're thinking about autonomy support. So here's a little interaction. And this child and parent are working on this box together.
Slides. Do you want some help opening it? Let me show you. So do you see this little hole here? I put my finger in and then I pull it out like a drawer. It's kind of like a drawer.
So she's asking if he wants support, and then she shows her, and then
you do it all by yourself.
Lets him lead here.
Did you see how I did that? Yep. Can you put your finger in the hole? You see Hugo right here? Can you put your finger? Yep, your finger in. Put your finger in. Do you want me to help you? Okay, can you put your finger in like this? And then you pull. Pull. So you put your finger in like that, and then pull. Yep, you gonna try? No. Open. Should you try to put it inside? Okay, we do it somehow.
Okay, so in this little interaction, we saw both the mom here modeling, providing some support, but also letting her child lead and explore this opening and closing of the box together. She didn't immediately jump in and open the box and then be done with it. And so when we're thinking about autonomy support, it not only builds children's executive function skills, but it also really requires executive function skills from the parent, right? So in this case, the parent has to be in a mental space where they have the time to follow their child, to build up, to wait, to control their impulses, to want to help their child, to wait and sort of let these moments sort of expand. And that takes a lot of executive functioning skills as well. And I want to bring this up too, of the, thinking about executive functioning skills, because one of the biggest things that impacts executive functioning skills is stress, right? And so many of us are experiencing stress right now, right? This is very common. I'm sure all of us at some point or another during these past weeks and months have had the experience where it's just so hard to focus. It's hard to figure out what to do. It's hard to pay attention. I certainly have, had challenges focusing, paying attention, wrapping my brain, or trying to get my brain to do what I want it to do. And that is an example of how stress impacts executive function skills, right? And when we're thinking about stress, we often think about 3 different types of stress. Perhaps you've heard of this before. We're thinking about positive stress. Positive stress is those things that maybe push us to do something new. Maybe the little bit of stress that I had or have as I'm giving a live presentation, right? It's pushing me to be really present and to try and do something new, right? And then we have tolerable stress. Tolerable stress is stressors that are harder. For some of us, this period may be in the tolerable stress period, right? Where it's stressful, we don't know what's going to happen next. But we have those supports. We have a support network. We're able to get through. And then there's those types of stresses that are really toxic stresses. And toxic stress is the stress that is unrelenting, that continues, that is there in absence of any support. And for some children and families and individuals, this right now is probably a period of toxic stress, right? Because there isn't those supports available, or the situation is so challenging. And we often think about positive, tolerable, and toxic stress in terms of children. We think about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and we know that the more toxic stress, the more adverse childhood experiences children have, the more it's correlated with poor health outcomes later in their lives. And this is because in these little bodies, it's having this constant stress, and perhaps, some of us have experienced this like day in and day out of really stressful in our bodies. It's like revving a car engine for weeks or months at a time. And our brains and our bodies are really not designed to function like that. And it can leave this sort of lasting patterns of functionality in the brain. But if for children, there is supportive adults there that are able to buffer that stress, to able to help them through that period of time, that those really challenging, even some of the most challenging situations can become moved into that tolerable stress bucket. And so we're thinking about this for children, and then we also think about this for adults, right? If we're thinking about when are adults able to help provide that support for children, they also need to have supports. Adults too can experience toxic stress, right? And so thinking about what are those community supports, what are those relational supports that help everybody through these times that are really challenging. So I'm going to wrap up this section about brain development to just sort of give a summary of the things that we've talked about. So if we're thinking about, here's a picture of our brain. When we're born with almost all of the brain cells that we'll ever have. And as we have experiences in our lives, we begin to form connections between the cells in our brain. And the more often we have those experiences, the stronger those connections become. And so in this way, our earliest experiences really build the foundational architecture of our brains. The experiences that we have often, those are the connections that we form. Those are the patterns of behavior that we build on through the rest of our lives. And again, as I said, we can always learn something new. As adults, we can learn something new. Nothing is set in stone, but it is this amazing period of opportunity, these early years when we're building the foundation for the rest of our lives. Okay, I'm gonna pause there and ask Terry or Elaine if there's any questions that have come up. And there are opportunities for questions at other points too, but I wanna pause and provide this opportunity for folks if there's anything that they'd like to ask at this point.
Hi, Amelia, this is Elaine, and you do have a couple of questions and a couple of comments.
Great.
The first one is, can you explain a little bit more about the pruning and blooming slide again, just to do a little bit deeper clarification on that?
Yeah, sure. I can actually go back to it here. So this one, right? Right, so really excellent question. So when we're thinking about this process in brain development, so what happens when we're young, in that early period of brain development, children are producing those millions of neuronal connections each second. They're learning all the time. We like to say that the brain is blooming. They're making connections. Now, what happens is children learn so much so quickly that they actually overproduce the amount of connections they need. They don't need all of those connections because they're learning so much from everything all the time. Not everything that they learn is important or essential to their lives going forward. And so what happens is that the things that they continue to do regularly over and over and over again, those connections get stronger. And those connections become the ones that are kept. And the things that they don't do very often that aren't important for their lives going forward, those connections get pruned away. And so we're left with a brain or like a rose bush that's really healthy and thriving. It's got those strong connections that are formed based on what children do often and frequently in childhood. And the extra connections that we don't need, they're pruned away. And I like to say that in this way, our brains really are exactly developed to our own unique lives, right? We shape the development of our brains through this process, through the experiences that we have. We get to sort of shape what's important to us and what's kept and what gets pruned away.
Great, thank you. And another question about, does bilingual brain activity also apply to sign language?
Yes, absolutely. I love that question. So yes, sign language, if we're thinking about like American Sign Language, for example, not necessarily like baby sign, like a few signs, but if we're thinking about American Sign Language, we see those same types of patterns of activity in the brain as children are learning two languages at once. And children who are learning sign language babble with their hands, right? And many children, right, if you're learning American Sign Language and then you're also learning later written English, you are bilingual, right? You've learned two different languages in two different ways to communicate, or whatever the second or third language might be. And I'll also say too that we haven't seen any sort of limit on language learning for young children. The lead researcher who does a lot of our language studies here, her children are learning 3 languages, and they're easily able to do that. I also wanted to point out too that there is no evidence that children with a language delay or developmental delay can't also learn 2 languages. What the research says is that a child with a language delay or disability will be able to learn 2 languages to the same ability that they would be able to learn one language.
Great. Okay, the next one is, how can we identify when children are stressed if they're always fine, quote unquote? If they just say, I'm fine, how do you identify when a child is stressed in that situation?
That's a really good question. And that's not something that I am an expert at, I have to say. Particularly for older children, we spend a lot of time thinking about younger children. So I'm sure there's some other experts here that spend a lot of time really thinking about children. But I would say thinking about, not only it's what the child says, but their behaviors too, right? Are they being avoidant? Are they, stress for children comes up in so many different ways. And that is one of the things that is so important, why there's so much training, and the people that work in this field are so specialized, right? To think about all of those different aspects that a child might respond with stress. So they might be really quiet. They might sort of want to be alone, or they might be really loud or really overactive. So I think it is knowing the child and knowing what their sort of typical patterns are, and seeing when they might be like, oh, I've noticed that they're really quiet, or they really need a lot of attention right now. And that's going to be different from child to child and from day to day.
Okay. Another question is, can postpartum depression affect brain development in a child?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think, what's important for brain development is that interaction between parent or parents and child. And so what might, the only way that it might affect would be if the child isn't getting that sort of that back and forth interaction that they need. But, that is not necessarily, it really depends on the length of time, right? If it's just a shorter period of time, children are very resilient. And as long as they're being cared for and physically taken care of, there are other times that child can have that sort of back and forth interaction. So if we're thinking about really long periods where adult is not responding at all or very little to a child, that is where we would think about the child's brain development. But let's say there's another caregiver in the home that can provide that kind of attention and care, that will be just fine and supportive for the child. And if it's just, a shorter period of time, like a month or a few months, that is also not going to have this sort of long-term impact on the child. It's just when it's a very prolonged period.
Okay. Another question is about pruning and ACE scores. How does that affect a child and the pathways above and nurturing positive pathways? So high ACE scores and pruning.
What's happening in the brain?
Yeah.
The brain the brain does its pruning. The process of, so it doesn't prune more or less depending on what's happening in the child's life. That just happens, sort of the amount of pruning just happens regardless. But if we're thinking about, it's more thinking about which of those connections are kept and which of them are not kept, right? So if we're thinking about a child that is experiencing trauma or toxic stress, they may build more connections in their brain that help them survive that experience that they're having. One of the things I like to think about when we're thinking about early childhood adversity is that, a lot of times people are worried that, is their brain, like people that are around the world, like damaged, for example. And I don't like to think about it like that. I like to think about our brains really are working to help us survive and hopefully thrive in whatever situation we're in. And so when a young child is experiencing trauma, their brains are forming those connections that are going to help them get through that trauma. But when that trauma is over, when they're put in this other situation, those connections, those patterns of behavior might not be the ones that then help them thrive in that new situation, right? And so what has to happen is that those children have to relearn those patterns of behavior, which is going to take some practice and time. It's not necessarily set in stone, but that's how I like to think about it. So our brains get fine-tuned to whatever that early childhood experience is to help them survive and, like I said, hopefully thrive. And then if there's that mismatch later on, then we have to think about how can we really help and support that child build new patterns of behavior and even neural connections at a later age.
Okay. Kind of building on that, can toxic stress in children prevent other development, such as language development, sensory development, cognitive development, or does it just impact executive function?
Yeah, you know, the brain is networked and it's all sort of linked together. So if a child is under a lot of stress, it is going to probably be harder for that child to learn language, other skills as well. I mean, you can think about it for yourself, right? If you're trying to learn a new language and you're really stressed, are you able to learn that language very well? It's hard, and it's hard partly because you can't focus because you need the executive function skills to be able to learn that language, right? And so I would say it's all really interrelated. And you can also think about sort of like resource management. If our brains are spending all of their time and attention just trying to like survive and get through, there's just not as much energy and space to, I'm talking like mental space, theoretical space, to learn another language, for example, or like continue building language skills or cognitive skills.
Great. We have a couple more, but I'm wondering about time if we should proceed with the next section.
Yeah, let's go on to the next section. But great questions. Thank you so much for asking all those questions and participating. I really appreciate it. It's really fun from my end. Okay, so this next section, I really want to talk about how we think about relationships building the brain. And this is an early study from iLabs that I think is lovely and I like to share. So one of our co-directors, Dr. Andy Meltzoff, this is one of the first research studies that he did back in the 70s. And he is really interested in relationships and how we learn. And one of the things he wanted to know is how early are children able to start imitating us? Because we know that's a really important way that children learn. And so what he did is he went to hospital rooms and with the caregivers, the parents' permission, he started making faces at babies. And what he found is that within an hour of birth, in some cases, many babies, not all babies, would make that exact same face back. And this is really amazing, you know. It's an early study, but it started to shift the way that we think about early childhood development. We are born wanting to be part of the conversation. We want to be involved in relationships. We want to be involved in this rich back and forth conversation from the moment of birth. We've gone on to think more about how our relationships with others develop. And one of the areas of research that we're really interested in right now at iLabs is the sense of touch. The sense of touch is one of the first ways that we have to communicate with infants before they understand language, right? We can soothe them and communicate with them in this way. And what we found is that from a very young age, children already have this really sophisticated response to touch. So what we did is we used that MEG machine again. We put young infants into the MEG machine and we touched their hand and we touched their foot. And what we saw is patterns of activity that look very similar to what would happen if an adult's hand was being touched or an adult's foot was being touched. So a complex representation of touch in the brain, or a complex understanding of touch in the brain, even from a very young age. And what's more, we found that not only did children's brains light up with activity when their own hand was touched, but they also lit up those same areas of their brain when they saw somebody else's hand being touched. And this is pretty amazing because even young infants are able to recognize in another person what that sense of touch, what that feeling of touch might be like. And while this is very early preliminary research, you can see how perhaps this is one of the ways that we start to build empathy and understanding for other people, right? We can say like, oh, you're like me. You have a hand, I have a hand. I understand what it's like when my hand's touched, and I understand what it's like when your hand is touched. And so from a very young age, children are already building this relationship and really complex understanding of other people. We've also done some research to think about how early are children able to understand adults' emotions. So we know that children, are born, they want to be part of the conversation. They want to be part of this back and forth. They're understanding from an early age what the experience of somebody else being touched might be like. So I want to build on this and think about how early are children able to read other adults' emotions, and particularly emotions that are not directed directly at the child. So I'm going to show you a video, and in this video, you're going to see one of our young volunteers. This is little Adrian, and Adrian is playing with some toys with a researcher, and then another researcher comes into the room. The first researcher shows that second researcher a new toy, and that second researcher doesn't like the toy, and she gets kind of angry at the first researcher, not at little Adrian, but at that second researcher. And then Adrian is given a chance to play with the toy, and I'll let you see what happens.
Teresa, I'm going to sit here and read a magazine. Okay, that's Kelly. Kelly's going to sit and read a magazine. Kelly, look at this.
That's aggravating. That's so annoying.
Oh, I thought it was really interesting.
Well, that's just your opinion. It's aggravating.
Can I see that? Thank you.
I'm going to go now, Teresa.
Kelly's going bye-bye.
All right, so you can see that in that movie, little Adrian was like, what did you just ask me to do? And so I have a question for you too, and then we'll do some more debriefing. So do you think that the child, that was Adrian, played with the beads after the angry adult, that was Kelly, left the room? Yes or no? Give you just 30 seconds to answer or so. All right, we have a little bit of a split here. About 60% of us think that Adrian did play with a toy, and about 40% said that he didn't. And the answer is that he did play with the toy. So as soon as the adult left the room, as soon as Kelly left the room, he was excited to play with the toy again. So, you know, it's not that this experience was so long lasting, certainly not traumatic in any way. It's more that thinking about in that moment from this very young age, he's able to read the emotions in the room, to understand that one adult is not happy with the other adult for playing with a toy. And if you notice from the study, we picked these really big words like aggravating and annoying that he probably wouldn't know yet. But he could tell from the emotions that that was something that that wasn't pleasing, that second adult. And so when he had the chance to play with the toy, he did not want to play with that. He was not going to take that chance while that angry adult was in the room. But as soon as the angry adult left the room, he was ready to play again. And so from this really early age, children have this exquisite ability to understand emotions and to base their behavior on those emotions. They're watching us all the time. And you know, I know Adrian's mom, and she was a little worried about, you know, going through this study. And Adrian and the angry researcher, Kelly, after the study had a happy interaction and everything was fine. So it was really specific to that specific moment. And I think that's important to bring up because it's not that we should never be angry in front of children, right? But more just the knowledge of knowing that they're paying attention and they're learning from us. One of the other things that I think is really important to think about is that children learn social biases by watching us as well. And we recently did a study to look at this a little bit more. So in this study, we had 4 and 5-year-olds come into the lab and they watched a little video. And they watched a video of a person. So in this study we had, they were, I believe they were all female. They were all white. We picked same race and gender for this particular study. They watched, one person was the central character. A second person came in, and that first character was really, gave them a toy. And so the same thing, like, here's a toy, but they did it with this really warm affect. So they're like, here's a toy. And then they watched that same central character give a toy to a second person. And that second person that came in, they said the same thing, but they had sort of a cold demeanor. They're like, here's a toy. And they had body language, and they were clearly not as comfortable with the second person. And when we asked the children, they were much more likely to want to give a toy again to the first person that was given that toy in that sort of like open, gracious manner. And then we went even further to ask who would they prefer. Then they had those first, the 2 women come in again, the one that was treated with this sort of warm, open affect, and the one that was treated with this cold affect. Those 2 women, they showed them again. And then they had 2 more friends that came in, and they were wearing the same color shirts as the first 2 women. And then we asked about those second women that came in. And the children were more likely to want to play with and be with the person that was treated warmly than the friend of the person that had been treated with sort of cold affect. And this is all just by watching. So children from a very young age pick up on what we do, what we say, how we act, what our body language is. And that really forms how children go through the world and think about how they're then going to treat other people. And I think that's an important thing to think about from this, again, early age. Children are watching us, paying attention to how we're interacting with the world, who we're interacting with, who we're not interacting with. And it's not always, you know, what we say. It's a lot of what we do and how we go through our lives. We do so much modeling for children, and there's real power in what we model for children. And it's not all, you know, I wanted to share this other example of how powerful modeling is, and the amazing tool that it can be, because children really are watching us and learning from us all the time. This is a study that I love that's out of MIT. And the researchers there were wondering if we can help teach children perseverance through modeling. And I'm going to show you a few different videos, but the basic setup is like this. So there's one group of children that see a researcher struggle with a puzzle. And she tries and tries and tries over and over and over again until she ultimately succeeds in fixing this puzzle. It's like a little tricky, like getting keys off a ring, I think. And then the child is given a tricky toy of their own to play with. And this tricky toy is so tricky that it actually doesn't work. You'll see it in the video, but there's this big plush box and it has a big button. And when the researcher pushes the button, it plays music, but it's a trick. There's nothing that that child can do to get that toy to play music. The second set of children see that first adult quickly succeed at a puzzle, and then they get the same tricky toy. So what we're comparing is, does it make a difference if the child watches the adult try and try and try and try before ultimately succeeding, when they themselves get a tricky puzzle? And so I'll show you this first video. This first video is a child that has watched an adult try and try and try before getting the chance to try herself.
Hey, all right. Now it's your turn to play with your toy. Look, this is your toy. It plays music. Now you get to play this and I'll be back in 2 minutes.
I love how she's trying her face, like maybe that is the way that we'll get it to work this time.
Can we try this with you together? Are you ready? Ready? Oh, there you go. You're all done.
Okay, so she ultimately gets the satisfaction of doing it. Now let's watch a video of a child that watched the researcher quickly succeed at her puzzle before this child gets a chance to play with her own.
It plays music. Now you get to play with this and I'll be back in 2 minutes.
She was like, no, thank you. This toy is broken. I do not want to play with it. So I love this study because it's such a lovely example of something that, you know, we don't always think about, right? From a child's perspective, it can sometimes seem like we get things as adults right all the time, you know? It seems like it's easy for us to go through the world. And for a child, they have to try so many things all the time. And so I love this idea of modeling persistence, of working through a hard problem and trying again and again and again. And children pay attention and learn from that too. I also wanted to point out, I've had a lot of questions about this study about temperament. Temperament certainly comes into play here as well. And what I'm sharing are two examples that are particularly prominent. A child that spent a particularly long time playing with the toy and a child that spent a shorter time playing with the toy. But when they averaged out all of the different children in this study, what they found consistently was the children that saw that adult try were much more likely to spend more time trying themselves than the children who didn't. So another way to think about how our relationships, how what we're modeling for children impacts how they grow and learn. And I'm gonna pause there again. This is another break for questions before we think a little bit about some environmental things as well.
Yeah, so here's a question just about the first study you showed, and one of the participants is wondering how old Adrian was at the time of that research.
Oh, yes. That's a good question. I think, do I have it in here? I think he's like between 14 and 18 months. So under
Okay.
2, in that range, yeah.
Great. Great. And this is a question that was asked before, but it sort of applies across the whole presentation. Does a premature child have more developmental difficulties in terms of brain development?
I think it really depends on how premature they are. If they're really, really premature, sometimes, but it is a case-by-case basis. And I think that's still something that doctors and researchers are looking at. A lot of times children that are premature, when they have the care that they need, they don't see any sort of lifelong impacts, but sometimes they do. So it is case by case. And they're born, some children are born so early that, their brains aren't quite ready for all of the stimulus that they get yet. And then also, one of the things that's really important are just all of the, like for example, one of the things that happens is that many of the connections in our brains get coated with this fatty substance that's called myelination. It helps our brains work faster, and it goes in our bodies and throughout our brains, throughout our bodies and brains. And it's really fatty. It's made out of fat, and it's one of the reasons why children need such a high-fat diet. And so really young babies might not have had that yet. And so making sure that they're getting the nutrition that they need, that they're getting as much as possible, some physical touch is really, really important. I left out a slide actually, maybe I can go back to it really quick in the case of time because it's related to this. Oh, right here. So when we're thinking about touch, it's really, really essential. And what researchers have found is that preterm newborns who receive massage therapy gain more weight and have shorter hospital stays than preterm babies who don't. And so as much as possible, figuring out how, because touch is so important and it soothes us. It's this early way to communicate, and that weight gain is something that's so important. Like I was just talking about for the myelination and for the rest of the body, and that's what we really want to see for really young infants who are born preterm. So there are ways, even from this early premature birth, to start building that relationship through touch. So yes.
So there's one more question that's left. It's really about the blooming and pruning. Mm-hmm. And the questioner is wondering if overgeneralization, for example, calling all women mom, is a sign of blooming. And as children as start to not overgeneralize, they start to distinguish, you know, this person is mom and this other person isn't mom. Is that an example of what happens when pruning occurs?
That's an interesting question. And I don't know exactly how those things line up. And I'm not sure exactly if anybody knows particularly, but I know exactly the learning trajectory that the questioner is asking. And it's definitely a step in language development, right? For example, a child might call every fruit an apple because they recognize a category, but they don't know the names for them all yet. And often that child knows that the other, like, and then if the adult, you know, comes in with a banana and is like, apple, the child's like, no, that's a banana, but they don't know the word yet. So they might still call it apple, even though they know that it's a banana. So that is sort of a, you know, a part of a step in language development where children know some words and they're able to recognize categories, but they don't know all the specific words yet. But it is a communication tool that they have, right? They at least have one word that they can use. But it is that point in language development is happening during this period of blooming and pruning, right? As adults, when we're learning a second language, we don't call everything a banana, right? You know, or like we don't call everything an apple. We'd probably be like, I don't know the word for that, right? So we go through a different process. So it is happening during that time, and how those things line up, I don't know exactly, but it is sort of the way that children are learning in this really immersive way is representative of all of those connections happening and forming so quickly, right? They're learning from everything. The way that really young children learn is different than how adults learn because of how quickly their brains are forming all of those connections. So it very well could be a sign of that. I think that's a really interesting question.
So it might be kind of an interrelation between language development and blooming and pruning.
Yeah, because as the language is developing, they're having that blooming in that language part of their brain, right? We also think about some children have that vocabulary spurt, right? You know, that's kind of an example of that. Some children don't. But that's an example of just how quickly children are learning. Mm-hmm.
Great, that's all the questions we have right now.
Okay, great. So one of the last chunks I want to talk about here are thinking about creating, like, what are environments that support brain development. And when we think about this, we really want to think about, you know, and environments broadly. So like the people in the environments, the things in the environments, what are the things that we can do to create environments that support brain development? And one of the earlier studies that we've done at iLabs, and if you've listened to talks from iLabs before, you are probably familiar with this study. We've been really interested in language learning, how children learn language, and what are the different ways that children can learn language. And so what we wanted to do is to see if children who are about 9 months old could begin to learn a second language through a variety of different methods. We wondered if they could start learning a second language through a live interaction. So children came in for about 12 20-minute sessions with a live teacher or tutor. It was kind of a play session. In this case, they were English learning infants who came in to learn Mandarin. And then a second group of children watched those same sessions on DVD, on TV. And then a third group just listened to the audio. So all three children experienced the same amount of language. It was just in different formats. And so I wonder if, I want to ask you, what do you think happened at the end of these 12 20-minute sessions? Which scenarios do you think children learned language in? Do you think it is A, from TV, they learned it from all three, TV, audio, and in person? Or B, just audio in person, C, TV and in person, and then D, only in person? There's the poll. I'll give you 30 seconds again. get your answers in. All right, so we have a variety of different answers here. A lot of people responded that they thought that babies learned language from TV, audio, and in person, and then sort of split through the rest. And what we found was really quite interesting. We found that children learned really well from that live interaction. They were able to start learning some of the sounds of Mandarin. They didn't learn anything from the audio session. They also didn't learn anything from the TV or DVD session, which points out just how important that live social interaction is for young children. Children learn from social interactions with other people, not from screens alone. And this is for really young children. As adults, you know, there are all sorts of language learning programs. We can learn language as adults from screens, but children are really dependent on that social interaction. In a social context, their brains know that this is important. This is something I need to pay attention to, and this is what I'm going to learn from. They don't really have the cognitive skills yet to understand what's going on the TV. They're sort of interested in it because there's bright colors, but they're not really gaining information in the same way they would be from a social interaction. I do want to point out, though, in this time when we're spending so much time with screens, that it's not necessarily the screen itself, it's the social back and forth interaction. So a follow-up study that we did is we asked if children, and this is about 2-year-olds, 2 to 2.5-year-olds, so the children in this picture are a little bit older, could learn new words through a back and forth live interaction through a video chat. So I'm thinking about chatting with a parent or a grandparent. And what we found is that in the live interaction and in the video chat, in this back and forth video chat, children learned from both contexts, right? So it's about the social interaction. That social interaction is so important. And they did another test where they had children watch a video where the speaker wasn't actually live. They just sort of asked them questions and paused. And the children knew that that wasn't a live interaction and then didn't learn from that. So it's really thinking about this back and forth live interaction. And so chatting with grandparents, you know, chatting with friends that you can't be with right now, chatting with caregivers that might be deployed overseas. Video chats can be really good ways for children to connect with people that they can't be with. So we don't want to say that, you know, screens are all bad. It's about the interactions. And same with really young children. So the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that there's very little screen time for children under the age of 2, though they've adjusted that a bit to think about children as young as 15 months old can learn from media when a caregiver is present and involved. So when we're thinking about really young children and screens, we're thinking about not from like what is on the screen, but who else is in the room, right? You can see this on this picture. There's this lovely interaction of a child and perhaps their mom having this interaction. So if there's an adult in the room that's also interacting with it, sometimes I like to think about media, screen media, as any sort of other media, right? Like crayons or a book, right? Having an adult there is going to make that experience really rich and have those conversations about what's going on. So it's important whenever there's a screen present to be really cognizant of what is the social interaction that's happening. That's when children are going to learn, particularly young children, from those interactions. Social environments are really important throughout our lives. Other researchers have looked at the power of social feeling like you're part of a team, social environments for older kids. So these children were 4 and 5. And we invited them into the lab and we had them play some games with puzzles. They were math puzzles. And we either told them that just to play some games, here's some math puzzles, or we said, you're on the green team. Here's the other members of your green team. Here's a green shirt. Here's a green tablecloth. There's a little green flag. And here are some puzzles to do. And what happened is that when the children felt like they were part of a team, even though there was no other children present, they were more motivated. They focused longer. They had higher scores, and they were more confident. And I love this, and I love thinking about this right now. I've been talking with this researcher, Allison Master, right now, and thinking about, you know, the power of social environments. And so many of us are not in any social situation, very little low social environments right now. But she said that adults and parents and many educators are trying to do this, to use this sort of language to remind children that they are part of this larger team, right? Thinking about language like we can do math together right now, or reminding children of their friends or their classmates that they might not be with right now, that they're part of that team, that they're part of this larger group. And for all of us at every age, that makes us feel connected and motivated as well. We have another researcher here. We thought about, you know, like, what is it like to feel like you're part of a team? This researcher wanted to know, what is it like, how does it impact us if we actually do something together at the same time, if we're in sync with each other? And so I love this study. She brought children into the labs, and she actually built a swing set in her lab. And she either had children swing exactly together or exactly out of sync with each other. And then she had them do a variety of tasks. And what she found was that the children who swung together in sync were better at these collaboration tasks. Here's a little video. So these girls had just had this experience together, and then they had to do this puzzle where one girl had to hand this toy over to another girl. And you can see how quickly they're doing it, and they've got this sort of coordinated pattern out, like one girl already has her hand like out, waiting for her other new friend to pass her the toy. And so that's another thing that I love. And also another thing to think about right now in this time when, you know, we might not be connected. What are ways that we can do things together? Like, can we dance together? Can we have some sort of feeling of connection, of doing something at the same time that makes us feel connected, and in children's case can actually help with social learning and collaboration, which I love. This section, you know, I want to talk about environment. So it's also important to think about, like, what is the physical environment, right? And I wanted to share some examples. This is from Urban Thinkscape in Philadelphia, where some researchers have been working with different neighborhoods and organizations to put different prompts into parks and bus stops and supermarkets. In this case, researchers found that adding storytelling prompts to a playground increased the child and caregivers' interaction and language use over the time that they were in that playground. So there are these environmental things that we can add, simple prompts. Like, here's another example from one study called Supermarket Speak. And in this case, researchers had these little notes that they left around grocery stores. So this one says, "Hey explorers, let's look for colors. How many colors can we find?" And I love this prompt because it's open-ended. It's more than a yes/no answer. It really invites participation. It's using language like, "Hey explorers," you know, that group that we were talking about before, you know, like, we're all explorers and let's look for colors, this invitation to engage. How many colors can we find? And putting these prompts around, researchers noticed that parents spent more time talking with their kids. There was more back and forth language exchange, that kind of language exchange that we know really helps support language development. And I love it because you know, these are the times, sometimes these are the times that we have with our children, right? We're at the store together, probably not right now, but at times when, you know, we're not all alone in the stores trying to get in and get out as quickly as possible. There's these opportunities throughout our days, at the playground, at the bus stop, at the grocery store, to engage in these sort of rich back and forth social interactions that we know support children's development. One more thing to think about environments too is that environments can really signal who belongs or who doesn't. This is a study that we did with high school students, and we're interested to see if an environment can impact a choice they make about classes. So in this study, we're asking a group of high school students how likely they would be to take a computer science class in each of these two classrooms. And I'll give you a closer look at them. So this first classroom was decorated in sort of stereotypical, you know, sort of geeky style. So there's posters everywhere. There's some game pieces on the floor, a little bobblehead. And then the other classroom that they were shown was this one, and a little bit more neutral. There's a plant, there's some art. And what we found was that for boys, it didn't really matter which classroom they were, which classroom they saw the picture of. They were equally interested in taking a computer science class in either classroom. But for girls, you can see that green on the right, they were much more likely to choose to take a computer science course if it had that more neutral decoration with the art and the plants. They were much more likely to want to take that class. And this is because of all those environmental signals, right? Our social connections are so strong to our environments that we're really picking up on what is going on in that room. What does this room say? Is it welcoming to me? Can I see myself there? Can I see myself with who I'm imagining might be in that room? Is this room designed for me? And this continues to toys as well. If we're thinking about young children and toys, we do a lot of work thinking about stereotypes, and particularly engagement with science, technology, engineering, and math. And this from another one of our affiliated researchers who's done a lot of work in this area. And she said, toys are communicating who's interested, who's good, and who belongs. So do children have access to toys in the environment that are open-ended and playful, and they get to explore all of the many dimensions of things that children are learning, right? There are so many toys that are branded for girls or for boys, right? You know, a boy might not, for example, pick up a doll and practice caretaking because it's not branded for him. And a girl might not pick up, you know, a building block set or a chemistry set or something like that because it's not branded for her. And so thinking about providing access to all children for all of these different rich activities, thinking about the environments, thinking about making them social. And these are all the different kinds of things that we're thinking about when we're building environments for children to grow and learn and thrive. Okay, I have one more pause for questions here before we have one last little section to go through. So have there been any questions in this last chunk that I can address here before we finish up?
Yeah, just a couple. One question is how would this media and social interaction work for babies as well as for infants or for toddlers and preschoolers?
Yeah, so are we thinking about like video chats, for example?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so, you know, babies, I think, very young, you know, like young babies are probably not gonna get as much out of a video chat as an older child would. But I think it's still okay. You know, I think some parents are worried that children shouldn't see any screens. I think it's still okay to like try and like wave to grandma and show to grandma, or, you know, say hello to a friend. And then as children build language skills and become have more and more skills in that back and forth interaction. They're more and more able to get something out of that video chat. The data I showed for that study where they were learning was 2-year-olds. So those are pretty young, 2 to 2.5-year-olds. So they're learning through that back and forth interaction. So as they build language skills, as they build cognitive skills, they're able to get more out of that back and forth interaction. But if it is a video chat that they're having, even really young children with their parents, and then, you know, their parents' friends or family members, that's certainly not going to be harmful. It's just that, you know, an infant might not learn a word through a video chat.
Got it. Thank you. And then there was a comment that was followed up with a question, which really go nicely together, in that this whole conversation has so many implications for our kids who are at home doing distance learning right now with little or no access to live interactions from teachers. So how will this time of school closures affect our kids who have to do distance learning? And do you have any words of wisdom for families who are trying to navigate this?
Yeah, I mean, this is an unprecedented time, right? I think for families that are trying to navigate this, I think there's so much pressure right now to try and recreate the classroom environment, and it's not, you can't do that. It's not normal, and you're not educators. And I think for parents, it is to be as easy on yourselves as possible, because this is a really challenging time. I think that, you know, children are resilient and are very adaptive. You know, they do have these amazing flexible brains where they're learning so much so often that I think, you know, they will, I think there's going to be ways to build back from this time, even if now is not the time that they're having that in classroom experience, right? I do think it's important to think about, you know, the equity piece in this, right? Not only are not all children able to access even videos of their classrooms, but thinking about when we're extra supports that may be needed, right? We know that often it is the summer break where children fall further behind when they are in lower resourced communities. And so this is an example of something like that happening for a longer period of time. So I think it's really important to think about how we're engaging when children are coming back into schools and making sure they have those wraparound supports to support them in this. The other thing I'd say too, again, like it's not possible to recreate the classroom experience, but looking for those everyday interactions that are great, right? You know, like making dinner is a great time for STEM learning, right? You can measure together, you can make predictions about you know, what something will taste like or look like when it comes out of the oven. Playtime is really rich too. Children learn so much through play. There's this one study that showed that young children spend about 50% of their free playtime exploring math concepts. And so playing along with children and finding ways to interact in this time that work for your family, I think is the most important. I think learning is particularly important, but making sure everyone is as comfortable and relaxed and just making it through this time, I think is the main thing, and to not feel so much pressure to try and recreate something or to like be perfect in this imperfect wild time that we're all in together.
Thanks, Amelia.
Yeah. All right, so we have a little bit of time left, and I just want to spend some time thinking together about how we're building supports for children and families in our communities. And this is a circle of support components of nurturing care for early childhood development. That is a project that is through the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and World Bank. And these are the different areas that they've identified are so important for supporting children: adequate nutrition, responsive caregiving, security and safety, opportunities for early learning, and good health. All of these need to be in place to really support children and families. And so as we go through this section, I want you to think about in your communities, where's an area for growth in this little pie chart, and what's a real area of strength? One of the things that I think is important to think about is, you know, how are children spending their time? This is a graph right here in yellow of how much time of a 16-hour day are children spending in formal learning environments? And so you can see the largest percentage of time that we spend in formal learning environments is in 1st through 12th grade. But if you look at the rest of the time, most of our time is not spent in formal learning environments. Learning is really lifelong, and we like to say life-wide too. So when we're thinking about schools and formal learning environments, they can't alone provide all of the supports that families and children need. And I think we're really seeing that right now too, as educators are doing their very best to provide as much as they can for families and children. There have to be other ways and supports throughout a community to support this learning that happens lifelong and life-wide, right? You know, I know many of you are familiar with this, but some of the best ways, particularly to support really young children, are investing in evidence-based home visiting programs. This is older data from the Parent-Child Home Program from King County that's now Parent-Child Plus, I believe. But what you're seeing in pink up top is of the Parent-Child Home Program graduates, the percent that are kindergarten ready that are compared to the statewide average and a comparison group. This Parent-Child Home Program has the components of those evidence-based home programs, which means that, you know, in this case, families received 2 30-minute visits per week for about 23 weeks. During the visits, the home visitor has a language and shared cultural background with the family that's very important, and is able to model behavior for parents that help enhance children's development. So it's really coming to the parents and supporting their knowledge and their children's knowledge. One way to think about this lifelong, life-wide learning. Another thing that is so important to think about is to take a strengths-based approach when we're supporting families and children, right? One size does not fit all, and we're seeing this a lot right now. Systems and programs need to be aware of, celebrate, be responsive to children's diverse skills and needs, right? And I think it's really important to celebrate, not just celebrate, to really be informed by different ways of knowing. And I wanted to share an example of that with you. So this is work from Stephanie Freiberg, who used to be at University of Washington. She's a member of the Tulalip tribe, and she's really interested in thinking about cultural models of education. And in this study, she was working with high school students who were American Indian or European American. And she looked at how much these different aspects, trust for teachers, interdependent representations of self, or independent representations of self, affected their grades. And what she found here, and so I'll give you an example. So trust for teachers would be something like, you usually get the grade you deserve from a teacher. An interdependent representation of self is, it's important to me that I make favorable impressions on others. So this really connected, interrelated orientation. And an independent representation of self, no matter what the situation or setting, I am always true to myself. And what she found, I think, is interesting and important to think about. For American Indian students, their trust for teachers and their interdependent representations of self, how strong those were, predicted their grades. For European Americans, it was only the independent representations of self that predicted their grades. So in white Western culture, we have this very strong orientation towards the individual, versus other cultures have different representations, right? It might be a more collective orientation. And so I think it's important to think about when we're thinking about creating different models and programs, right? The white Western view is not, that's not a one size fits all, right? Everyone comes with different skills and backgrounds and ways of being in the community. And my final sort of thought here is to really think about applying an equity lens when we're planning supports for young children and families. And to help you think about that, I want to think about, it's not just, again, formal or learning environments that we're thinking about. When we're thinking about providing supports for families, there are so many different areas to think about. There's family leave policies. We're seeing a lot of that right now. There's high quality childcare. There's available, affordable childcare slots. So is that high quality care available? Is it affordable? Is there affordable housing? Is there a living wage? Are there access to medical services, libraries? Is there transportation? And is access to information in a preferred language? So it's not just one area, right? It's really thinking about all of the different systems that impact children and families. And again, right now we're seeing how all of these different systems are interacting as we're trying to figure out what is going on in how we're managing in this time. One final thought to share with you is thinking about, when we're thinking about what skills the next generation will need, so much emphasis is placed on knowing your ABCs, your 1, 2, 3s, but when we're thinking about what's going to help children succeed in the next generation, it's these kinds of skills: taking turns and seeking help, solving problems, leading and following in play, the ability to self-regulate, their ability to control their impulses, to explore the environment, to understand routines, to be aware of their emotions, and to shift attention well. And these are all the skills that we're building in that early period of brain development through interactions, through relationships. For all of this, connection is key. Staying connected, learning in relationship as much as we can, even in these challenging times, is so important to building children's brains. And I just really want to thank you for taking so much of your morning to spend with us. There's my contact information. Feel free to ask me any questions over email. If you're interested in more work that we're doing, we have a whole suite of free online training modules that are available on our website, and the web address is right there. And then I will turn it over, see if there's any questions. And I know, Terry and Elaine, you have some closing thoughts for us as well.
Yeah, so thanks, Amelia. There were not any questions on the last section, but a couple of recommendations of resources.
Great.
One was a Circle of Security Parenting and how well that supports parents learning to support autonomy with their children. And then the Essentials for Childhood framework, which you can Google and find. And those are some great resources, and I hope that folks will just keep thinking of good resources to share among yourselves. And now, Elaine.
Something's not working. Can you hear me? Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. There I am. Okay, so thank you, Amelia, for such a great presentation. We really learned a lot. And, for somebody that's sat through a number of brain development trainings, I actually learned a whole bunch of new stuff. So thank you for that. The information you gave us this morning really highlights the importance of having positive early learning experiences for a child's later development and success in life. So thank you. I also want to thank Molly and United Way for their support in putting on today's webinar. As Terry said in her opening remarks, a second opportunity for more learning like today will take place on May 29th, either in this format or in live session, we don't know. That session's going to build on this one, and it's going to give us a deeper understanding of infant and early childhood mental health. So be on the lookout for registration information coming soon. We want to leave you today with a reflective question to think about. So take a minute and jot down your answer to this question. What's one thing you heard today that you will share with someone who wasn't here? So again, what's one thing you heard today that you will share with someone who wasn't here? And I'm going to put mine down here so I don't forget. Okay. So as you exit this webinar, please continue to ponder that question and make it happen. Follow through on it. So have a great day, everyone, and thanks for joining us.